to create slaves out of the Native Americans. But the Native Americans did not really work very well for this kind of labor because they, one, weren't used to that kind of hard labor, and secondly, the European diseases really took their toll on the Native Americans, and so they either worked them to death or they died of this disease. Or another thing they could do was escape, because they knew the land, they knew where they were going, and so it was a lot easier for them to escape. And so the southern colonists turned to the slave trade that already existed. Was established by the Dutch. The Dutch had created the slave trade over 100 years prior to this, and so because this was already established, the southern colonists just sort of moved into this slave trade and used these slaves for their workforce. Now, two important parts of this were what we call the triangular trade route. And the triangular trade routes were basically a connection between West Africa, the Caribbean, and New England and England. So where they had the slaves in West Africa, they had sugarcane in particular in the Caribbean, and that's where they was sort of the holding place for the slaves. And then many of the slaves were sent oftentimes to New England as the next stop, where they would be then sent to the colonies where they were needed, and then they would take that money or other goods or raw materials and send those to England. So if you want to see a full kind of explanation of the triangular trade route, you can click on this link, and this will take you to an interactive map where you can actually see all the different goods that were traded between these areas. Now, the one part of the trade route, particularly from the West African area to the Caribbean, was what was known as the Middle Passage. And this was the beginning of a slave's life as a slave, and was probably the most brutal part of their life, because this was this trip from West Africa to the Caribbean. It took about 3 months, and it was terribly brutal, because if you see in this picture, you can see this is how the slaves were transported. As you can see here, they are packed shoulder to shoulder as tightly as they can be, basically laying on planks all the way down the length of the ship. You can see even these guys have their feet up against another row's heads. Wherever they could put a body, they would put someone. And if you look at this one, this is a row around the bottom of the ship that is actually about 2.5 to 3 feet below this row. So they really only had a very small amount of space to stay. So this was just a brutal, brutal voyage. They would take them out of this hold area about once a week or once every 2 weeks to kind of clean them off, remove any of the slaves that had passed away, and then clean up these planks. But essentially, they did everything they needed in this area. They ate, they slept, they took care of anything else that they needed to in this area. And so this was just a miserable and brutal trip to begin the slaves' passage to the New World. Now, politically, we have some precedents in the colonies. The first one is what we call Bacon's Rebellion. As you can see here, this is Nathaniel Bacon. Doesn't really look like much of a threat, but he proved to be one to William Berkeley, who was the governor of the Virginia colony at the time. And in 1676, Nathaniel Bacon decided to lead an army against the government in Virginia, because basically they had taken a pro-native stance and were not protecting the settlers against the natives. And so Bacon got about 300 to 500 men together, not only to attack the Native American tribes that were attacking them, but they just kind of indiscriminately attacked other Native American tribes that were in the area. And then they went to Jamestown, where William Berkeley had set up the capital, and they attacked and burnt down the capital of Jamestown, and then occupied it for a couple weeks. Now, in that time, William Berkeley fled Jamestown and was waiting for troops to back him up coming over from England. Now, in the midst of that, when Nathaniel Bacon was holding Jamestown hostage, he was basically in a small house, and he couldn't leave because, well, he was holding it hostage. And at a time, it was very dirty. There was no running water. The sanitation was terrible. And in that time, he died. He actually died of dysentery. And that kind of ended the rebellion. There was another man that sort of stepped up to take his place, but most of the men kind of left after Nathaniel Bacon, who was the original leader, after he had died. And so in October of 1676, that was the end of Bacon's rebellion. What this did was really sort of establish this idea that the colonists, if they were dissatisfied with the government, had the option and the opportunity to rebel, which obviously we know leads later to the larger American Revolution. Another political precedent established during the colonies was the Salem witch trials. In the colony of Massachusetts, they had what were known as town meetings, these very small, direct democratic meetings that, for most of the time, worked fairly well in deciding what was going on in the government. However, they did have some pitfalls in that everybody could participate in these, and when it comes to the Salem witch trials, in 1692 there were girls that basically accused many of the townspeople of being witches. Now, this led, as this was, as I mentioned before, a very religious area, led to hysteria about witchcraft taking over the area, and essentially what they said was that, well, if you can prove that you're not a witch, then we will believe you and we'll move on. But really, it's pretty impossible to prove you're not a witch, because they would have tests such as throwing you into a river, and if you drowned, you were not a witch, but you died. But if you did not drown, then you had somehow used witchcraft. Now, the idea of swimming, not a lot of people knew how to swim at the time, so that clearly wasn't a reason that you had not drowned, so it was obviously witchcraft. They did a few other ways of testing whether people were witches. One of my favorites was what was called pressing. They would put a person between two boards and then stack heavy rocks on top of the boards until basically they suffocated that person. Now, obviously, if you could escape that, then you were a witch, but if you could not escape that, that proved that you weren't, but you were dead. There was one instance of a burning at the stake in the Salem witch trials. Obviously, if you could escape the fire, you were a witch. If you did not, then you just died. But the idea was that if you did not want to be accused of being a witch, you could just name other people that were witches, and that would eventually excuse you, and you would renounce your witchcraft ways, and then they would move on to somebody else. But what ends up happening is this goes on until there's an execution of about 20 men and women, and eventually it's stopped by the governor of Massachusetts, not just the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but all of Massachusetts, and a stop is put to that. But it shows that this sort of direct democracy, in some ways, only has its pitfalls when it comes to a hysterical nature like this. Now, the last precedent we're going to talk about is certainly a more positive one than the Salem witch trials, and that is in Maryland. It's called the Maryland Toleration Act, and in fact this is quite the opposite of what is going on in Massachusetts. The Maryland Toleration Act established religious toleration for all Christians, regardless of being Puritan, being Catholic. Any denomination of Christians had religious toleration in Maryland, and obviously this leads to our idea of freedom of religion that's in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but obviously this is limited because it only includes Christians. There is no talk of people that are Jewish or non-Christian even. There was no toleration for that, but this does sort of at least set a basic precedent. Now, we've talked about all of these different ideas, the political, social, and economic elements that really set some basic ideas for the 13 colonies and eventually for the revolution that we'll be talking about a little bit later.